You know, I think one of the great things about Sarah is that she said, hey, my wrong be upon thee. You know, I'm sorry, I screwed up. I messed up. I made a mistake. She was able to admit that to her husband and say, hey, I made a mistake here. I was wrong. And that's a great attribute. We need preachers who can admit when they've been wrong. We need Christians who can admit when they've been wrong. Children who will admit to their parents, yes, Mom, yes, Dad, I did wrong. I guarantee, children, you'll get less punishment from your parents when you just admit that you did wrong than when you try to argue and prove that you were right. That doesn't work. Just admit you're wrong. You know, when you mess up on the job, admit it. Admit it. Preachers who preach false doctrine, they need to admit it. And look, there are so many preachers that are dug in on so many false doctrines, and it's like, you prove it wrong, they see that they're wrong, but they just don't want to admit it. It's like they can't admit that they ever preached something wrong in the past, so it's like, well, if I used to preach that Israel was God's chosen people, I got to just stay with that until the bitter end. Well, if I used to preach the pre-trib rapture, I guess I better just stay with that, even if it's proven to be false. Now, isn't that an irritating thing? Now, look, every preacher is going to make mistakes and say wrong things, myself included. Look, I've been preaching now as a pastor for 13 years. Before that, I counted how many sermons I preached before that. It was over 500. So I preached over 500 before I started pastoring. Since I've pastored, I think I've preached about, 2,000? Because I preach approximately 150 times per year. Okay, so do the math on that. 150 times 13 years, what's that, 1,950? And then I'm already deep into this 14th year of preaching. So, you know, I've preached over 2,500 hours of preaching. And the vast majority of that is online. So there are literally over 2,000 hours of my preaching on faithforwardbaptist.org. And I got news for you. If you go back through 2,500 hours of preaching, you're going to find mistakes that I've made. I'm going to find mistakes that I've made. I'm going to go back and listen to stuff and say, you know what? I was off on that. I was wrong on that. Now, here's the thing. At that point, as a preacher, I've got two choices. I can say, well, if that's what I preached back then, I better just stay with that until Jesus comes because I can't ever admit that I made a mistake. Or I can say, you know what? I was wrong about that. Now I'm going to preach it right. Now, what do you think makes more sense? And who are you going to have more respect for? The guy who preaches it right or the guy who just digs in and refuses to change even when he's proven wrong or even when he just finds out that he's wrong? Now look, there have been things that I've preached over the years that were in error. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm a horrible person. It just means that I'm a human being. Okay? And any preacher is the same way. I've had some people literally point out to me and say, hey, you said this wrong thing, and so now I feel like I can just never listen to you again because I just can't trust you. You know what? You shouldn't have been trusting me in the first place because you know what? I'm human. And you should search the scriptures daily whether these things are so and not just blindly listen to preaching anyway. You should be following it up. Now, thank God, I can't point to any huge, massive, horrible mistake that I've made in my preaching. You know, at least up to this point, I haven't preached something that was horribly wrong. But I could name for you things that I was wrong about over the years and that I had to correct later and say, you know, I used to think it was like this, but now I realize it's like this. Now, if the pastor's changing what he believes every week, that's a scary thing. But there are going to be times, even when you do diligence, and even when you're careful, and you try hard and study, you are going to make mistakes. I'm going to make mistakes. You know, I think about my Revelation series that I did. I preached through the book of Revelation back in 2007. And you know what? There were several things that I got wrong. And then when I re-preached Revelation in 2013, I preached it right. I didn't just say, well, I better make sure this matches 07. Because, you know, I don't care what 07 Stephen Anderson said. Because 2013 Stephen Anderson had learned more and tweaked some things and corrected some things and gotten some things right. Okay? And then, you know, I preached on Daniel back in 2010. And then I just preached Daniel again recently. You know what? My Daniel series from 2010, I made a bunch of mistakes. I hope you'll listen to my new Daniel series and focus on that. Why? Because I learned more. You know, some people learn and some don't. Some people grow and some don't. And so I'll stand up here right now and tell you, you know, in my Revelation series in 2007, I got the 144,000 wrong. I didn't get it. I didn't understand it. I was just shooting from the hip, you know, because that subject confused me. But by 2013, I figured it out. And I guarantee you that there's something in that 2013 series that isn't right. Go find it. Go pick me apart. You know what? But I'd rather get up and preach thousands of hours of preaching and make a couple mistakes, but still be preaching the truth, preaching right in general, even though I made a few errors, than to just accomplish nothing. Like the critics who sit back and have no achievements, you know what I mean? And they want to pick apart people who are willing to admit they're wrong. And you know what? I wish pastors all across America would just admit that they're wrong on some things and just get them right. You know, we need to get used to doing that. But the sad thing is that when you correct something, people, they don't often give you credit of, oh, well, good. At least he was willing to admit that he's wrong and get that right. Here's what they'll say. Oh, you flip-flopped. Here's what you preached 11 years ago, and now you flip-flopped. Listen, I'm not a politician, so I don't flip-flop. I guess, you know, politicians flip-flop where, like, before they're elected, they say one thing, and then as soon as they get elected, it's the opposite. Or before they run for office, they say one thing, and they say, look, I've been in office now for over 13 years. So there's no flip-flop needed. But you know what? There are some things where you just learn more. And when someone points out, well, you preached this 11 years ago. You know what? When I preached that, I was wrong. So what? Listen to the current stuff that I'm preaching. Because guess what? You're not going to believe this, but when I was 24 years old, 25 years old, 26 years old, working 80 hours a week at my fire alarm job and pastoring a church at age 26, I made some mistakes. I said some dumb stuff. I preached some things that were incorrect. But you know what I'm going to do? Correct them. Fix them. Change them. I'm not just going to be like, oh, well, I better make sure that my new Daniel series matches my old Daniel series exactly. I don't give a rip because I'd rather make sure it matches God's Word exactly. You know, it's more important to me that on whatever today's date is. Oh, wait, here we go. Today is the 13th Sunday. It's more important to me that on May 13th, 2018, I match up with God's Word than that I match up with Steven Anderson from 2008. Now, thank God, 99% of my preaching from 2008 is going to match 2018, and that's why I leave all those sermons online. I leave all those MP3s on the website so that people can listen to them, and you can go all the way back and listen to all that preaching. But you know what? If I had preached something seriously wrong back then, and it was a major error, you know what I would do? I'd go back and delete that sermon. Oh, you're trying to hide stuff. Yeah. Yeah, why would I want to put something that's inaccurate front and center? You know, I went back and deleted my old Daniel series because I was like, there's a new Daniel series. Why would you listen to the old one? And there wasn't anything seriously wrong with the old one. It was just little things, but I felt that the new Daniel series superseded the old Daniel series. You know, but if I had something that was seriously wrong, seriously in error, I'd go back and delete it and preach it right. And that's what these bunch of pre-tribbers need to do. That's what these bunch of Zionists need to do. They need to just delete that stuff and say, I was wrong, let me preach it to you right. And if you think that any preacher is 100% accurate or never makes mistakes, you're a fool. So why would you attack someone for correcting their doctrine? That's a lot better than digging in on the wrong doctrine. It's way better to say, hey, I made a mistake, here's the right doctrine, than to just say, well, I just don't change. We just don't change. Well, you know what? I do change. I do change. I learn more, and I grow more. And I'm not the same as I was. You're just not the same anymore. Yeah, you're right. I learned some new stuff. You know, and I would to God, every pastor would keep learning. You know, but that mentality is a wicked and stupid mentality. And it causes people by their pride to just stick with false doctrine because they're not willing to change when confronted with the truth. Okay, how do we apply that to our lives? You know what? When your husband has to correct you, why don't you just admit that you made a mistake and just take the correction? When your parents have to correct you, take the correction. When someone shows you from the Bible, hey, look, what you believe about this passage is wrong, you know what you should say? Wow, you're right. I was wrong about that. This is a great attribute. So why was Sarah such a godly person? Why is she the greatest female character, arguably, of the Old Testament? She was a person of great faith. She was a person who obeyed her husband and obeyed the Lord. And she was a person who could admit when she made a mistake. And we should take all three of those characteristics and be like Sarah. Especially ladies can emulate Sarah. But even us men, we can work on what? Our faith, our obedience to our God-given authorities, and our ability to admit that when we've made a mistake and correct it.